The sound came first, carried on the bitter Wyoming wind like a wounded animal's cry. Jacob Morrison paused in his evening chores, his weathered hands gripping the barn door as he listened. 63 years of living on the edge of the wilderness had taught him to recognize every sound the land could make, but this was different. This was human pain cutting through the November darkness. He grabbed his lantern and followed the sound across the frost-covered ground, his boots crunching through thin ice that had formed over the day's puddles. The temperature was dropping, fast, the kind of cold that could kill a person in hours without proper shelter. Whatever was out there wouldn't survive the night. 20 yards from his cabin, near the old cottonwood that marked the boundary of his property, he found her. A young native woman, maybe 18 or 19, lay crumpled against the tree's massive trunk. Blood darkened the earth beneath her left leg, and her breathing came in short, visible puffs in the frigid air. Her traditional dress was torn, her long black hair matted with dirt and ice. Jacob had lived alone on this ranch for 15 years, ever since his wife Sarah passed. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, with the simple rhythms of caring for his small herd of cattle and the few horses he kept for work. People complicated things, brought trouble and obligations he'd learned to avoid. But looking at this girl, barely more than a child, dying slowly in the cold, he couldn't walk away. "Easy now," he murmured, setting the lantern down and kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and fever-bright, watching him with a mixture of fear and resignation. She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged, words in a language he didn't understand. The wound on her leg was deep, probably from a fall onto sharp rocks, and infection was already setting in. She needed warmth, medicine, and care, but most immediately, she needed not to freeze to death in the next few hours. Without hesitation, Jacob scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and fevered skin, and she didn't resist. As he carried her toward his cabin, but something made him pause halfway to the door. The wind had died to almost nothing, and in that sudden stillness, he heard it again, that same sound that had drawn him outside. Only now he realized it wasn't coming from the girl. It was coming from the darkness beyond his property, a low, rumbling call that seemed to echo from the hills themselves. The girl in his arms stirred, turning her head toward the sound, and for just a moment, her lips curved in what might have been a smile. "What is that?" Jacob whispered, but she had already lost consciousness again. He carried her inside and laid her on his own bed, the only real bed in the small cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, so he quickly added logs and stoked the flames until orange light danced across the rough wooden walls. Heat began to fill the space, but he could tell it wouldn't be enough. The girl was shivering violently, her skin pale and cold to the touch. Jacob had treated injured animals plenty of times, but a person was different. Still, basic care was basic care. He cleaned the wound on her leg as gently as he could, applied the salve he used on his horses, and wrapped it with clean cloth torn from one of his old shirts. She never woke during the process, though she murmured words in her native language, sounds that seemed to carry meaning beyond his understanding. By the time he finished, the fire was roaring, filling the cabin with blessed warmth. But something told him it wasn't enough, that she needed more than just shelter from the cold. She needed something deeper, something that spoke to whatever had brought her to his land on this particular night. Acting on instinct he couldn't explain, Jacob gathered more wood and carried it outside. 20 feet from his cabin door, in full view of the bedroom window, he built a second fire. Not just a practical fire for warmth, but something larger, more intentional. He arranged the logs in a pattern his grandfather had shown him years ago, back when the old man still told stories about the early days and the people who had lived on this land before the ranchers came. As the flames grew higher, reaching toward the star-filled sky, Jacob felt something shift in the air around him. The wind picked up again, but instead of bitter cold, it carried scents of sage and sweetgrass, smells that reminded him of ceremonies he'd glimpsed from a distance in his younger days. The fire crackled and danced, casting long shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than just following the wind. From inside the cabin came a sound that made him turn. The girl was awake, standing at the window despite her injured leg, her hand pressed against the glass as she watched the fire. A burn! Tears streaked her face, but her expression wasn't one of pain. It was recognition, gratitude, and something else he couldn't name. She said something in her language, her voice carrying clearly through the thin cabin wall, and again, that distant rumbling answered from the hills. But this time, Jacob could swear he heard something else in that sound. Not just one voice, but many. A chorus of calls that seemed to acknowledge the fire, the girl, and perhaps even him. He stayed outside, feeding the fire through the long, cold night, watching over both the flames and the girl, who had somehow found her way to his isolated ranch. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob finally allowed himself to rest. The girl was sleeping peacefully now, her breathing steady and strong. He had no idea that his simple act of compassion was about to change everything he thought he knew about his land, his solitude, and the ancient connections that still pulsed beneath the surface of the modern world. Jacob woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something earthy and medicinal that he couldn't identify. Sunlight streamed through his cabin windows, and for a moment he wondered if the events of the night had been an elaborate dream. Then he heard movement in his kitchen and remembered. The girl was standing at his stove, moving carefully to favor, her injured leg stirring something in his coffee pot. She had braided her long hair and somehow cleaned the dirt from her face and hands. In the morning light, he could see she was even younger than he'd thought, with delicate features and intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "Good morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned and smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison." Her English was clear and precise, with only the slightest accent. "I hope you do not mind. I added some medicine to your coffee for healing." Jacob blinked in surprise. "You know my name? Your wife's grave marker is visible from the window. Sarah Morrison, beloved wife. I am sorry for your loss." She poured coffee into 2 cups, the liquid steaming and aromatic with an unfamiliar but pleasant scent. "My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language." He accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich smell. "How's your leg this morning?" "Much better, thanks to your care." "And the fire?" She gestured toward the window, where the ashes of his nighttime fire were still visible. "You built it in the old way, the way my grandmother taught was proper for healing ceremonies. How did you know?" Jacob sipped his coffee, surprised by the complex flavors that seemed to warm him from the inside out. "I didn't know. I just felt like it was the right thing to do." Ayana studied his face carefully, as if reading something written there in lines and weathered skin. "My grandmother would say that some knowledge lives in the heart, not the mind, that perhaps your spirit remembers what your head has forgotten." They sat at his small kitchen table, drinking coffee as the morning sun climbed higher. Outside, Jacob could hear his cattle moving around the water trough, their normal routine undisturbed by the previous night's events. Everything seemed ordinary except for the woman sitting across from him, and the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted in his world. "What brought you to my land last night?" he asked eventually. Ayana's expression grew serious. "I was traveling to visit my aunt in the next valley. My horse threw me when we encountered a bear near the creek. I walked for hours before I collapsed at your tree." She paused, staring into her coffee. "But my grandmother always said there are no accidents, only meetings that were meant to happen." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was a medicine woman, a keeper of the old stories. She passed last winter, but before she died, she told me about this place, about the rancher who lived alone by the sacred spring, who carried sadness, but also great kindness." Ayana looked up at him. "She said one day the land would call me here and I would know why." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Sacred spring, your well. The water that feeds it comes from deep in the earth, from places where the spirits still walk." My people have known about it for generations. It's why the wild ones come to drink, why the land around it stays green even in drought years. Before Jacob could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was low and rhythmic, like distant thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the earth itself, growing steadily louder. Ayana's eyes widened. They're coming. Who's coming? She stood carefully, moving to the window, and Jacob followed. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Across the rolling hills that surrounded his ranch, dark shapes were moving. Not the scattered dots of cattle or the occasional deer he was used to seeing, but something else entirely. Horses, dozens of them, moving in a loose formation toward his property. Their coats ranged from deep black to golden brown to spotted paint, and they moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had never known halter or saddle. At their head ran a magnificent stallion, his mane flowing like a black banner as he led the herd down the slope toward Jacob's well. "Wild mustangs," Jacob whispered. "I've never seen so many together." 53, Ayana said quietly. "The same number that came to drink when my great-grandmother performed the last water blessing ceremony 60 years ago." Jacob stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because this is what my grandmother told me would happen. When the keeper of the spring performed an act of pure compassion, when he lit the healing fire in the old way, the wild ones would return to show their approval. They would come without fear, drink from the sacred water, and mark the beginning of a new time." The lead stallion had reached the well now, his head lowered to drink from the clear water that bubbled up from deep underground. One by one, the rest of the herd approached, showing none of the skittishness Jacob would have expected from wild horses near human habitation. They drank calmly, peacefully, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "This is impossible," Jacob breathed. "Wild horses don't behave like this around people. They do around the right people, around those who understand that all life is connected, that kindness creates bridges between worlds." Ayana placed her hand on his arm. "You saved my life last night, Mr. Morrison, but you did more than that. You honored the old ways without knowing them, and the land has taken notice." As they watched, the stallion lifted his head from the water and turned directly toward the cabin. For a long moment, his dark eyes met Jacob's through the window, and the old rancher felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, respect, an acknowledgement that something sacred had taken place. Then, the stallion whinnied once, a clear, carrying call that echoed across the valley. As if it were a signal, the entire herd began to move, flowing around the well like water around a stone, drinking their fill before gradually dispersing back toward the hills. But they didn't retreat with the nervous energy of wild creatures, fleeing human presence. They left with dignity, with purpose, like participants in an ancient ceremony that had been completed successfully. Jacob stood at the window long after the last horse had disappeared over the ridge, his coffee growing, cold in his hand. Beside him, Ayana smiled with quiet satisfaction. "My grandmother was right," she said softly. "You are the keeper of the spring, and now the wild ones have blessed your stewardship." Word spread faster than wildfire through the valley. By afternoon, 3 neighboring ranchers had ridden over to see if the stories were true. Had Jacob Morrison really been visited by a herd of wild mustangs that drank from his well without fear? 50 horses, just standing there calm as Sunday, reported Tom Fletcher, who'd witnessed the scene from his ridgeline. Never seen anything like it in 30 years of ranching. Jacob sat on his porch with Ayana, watching the small crowd of visitors gather near his well. The girl's leg was healing remarkably fast, and she moved with only the slightest limp now. She'd insisted on staying to help him understand what was happening. "They're looking for signs," she said quietly, observing the men who poked around. The area where the horses had stood. They want a logical explanation for something that defies logic. Can you blame them? Yesterday, I would have been doing the same thing. Old Pete Garrison, the oldest rancher in the county, approached the porch with his hat in his hands. "Jacob, I knew your grandfather well. Good man, respected the land and the people who came before us. He ever tell you stories about this place?" Jacob frowned, searching his memory. Some. He used to say the spring was special, that it never ran dry even in the worst droughts. But I figured that was just old man talk. Wasn't just talk. Pete's weathered face was serious. Your grandfather made a promise to a Shoshone chief back in 1852. Chief Running Bear was dying of fever, and your grandfather gave him shelter, shared his medicine, treated him like family. Before he passed, the chief blessed this land and the water that flows beneath it. Ayana leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. What kind of blessing? Said that as long as the land was held by someone with a good heart, someone who showed kindness to all people, regardless of their blood, the spring would remain sacred. The wild horses would know it, and they'd come to drink when the time was right. A chill ran down Jacob's spine. You're saying this has happened before? Once, about 20 years after your grandfather took ownership. Story goes that he helped a wounded Paiute woman during a harsh winter, and the next day, wild horses came to the well. Folks thought it was coincidence then too. Pete replaced his hat carefully. But your grandfather knew better. He understood that some things can't be explained, only honored. The other ranchers had finished their examination and were mounting their horses to leave. As they rode past the porch, their expressions ranged from skeptical to thoughtful. Only Tom Fletcher paused to speak. Whatever's happening here, Jacob, it's brought something peaceful to the valley. My cattle have been calmer since yesterday. My horses less spooked by storms. Might be nothing, might be everything. Either way, I'm grateful. As the visitors departed, Ayana stood slowly and walked to the edge of the porch. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that made the whole valley glow. The blessing is awakening, she said softly. My grandmother told me that when the old agreements are remembered and honored, the land responds. Your grandfather made a promise to my people, and you've kept it without even knowing. But I didn't know. I just saw someone who needed help. That's exactly why it worked. True compassion doesn't come from knowledge, it comes from the heart. Your grandfather chose this land well, and the land chose you well in return. Jacob joined her at the porch railing, looking out over his property with new eyes. The well that had always seemed like just a practical necessity now appeared different, somehow more significant. The rolling hills that surrounded his ranch seemed to pulse with quiet energy. What happens now? He asked. Now you become what you've always been, just more consciously, the keeper of the sacred spring, the bridge between worlds. The horses will return when they're needed, and other signs will follow. Ayana smiled. And you won't be alone anymore. The land has marked you as one of its protectors, and that comes with both responsibility and community. As if summoned by her words, a single horse appeared on the ridgeline where the herd had vanished that morning. The black stallion stood silhouetted against the dying light, his magnificent form perfectly still as he gazed down at the ranch. He's watching over the spring now, Ayana whispered. And over you. The old agreements are in place again, the ancient connections restored. Your grandfather would be proud. The stallion remained motionless for several more minutes, a guardian, a presence on the hill. Then, with a gesture that seemed almost like a nod, he turned and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Jacob with the profound sense that his quiet, solitary life had just become part of something much larger and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined. 3 days later, Ayana announced she was ready to continue her journey to visit her aunt. Her leg had healed completely, showing no sign of the deep wound that had nearly cost her life. She stood in Jacob's kitchen, packing the few belongings she'd arrived with, while he struggled with an unexpected sense of loss. You don't have to leave, he said quietly. I mean, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. She smiled with gentle understanding. The land called me here for a purpose, and that purpose is complete. You know who you are now, what your role is. But this isn't goodbye forever. Before Jacob could ask what she meant, the sound reached them again, that low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. They moved to the window and saw an incredible sight. The entire herd had returned, but this time they weren't just coming to drink. The 53 Mustangs had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the well, their heads turned outward as if standing guard. At the center, the black stallion stood with 3 other horses, their coats shining in the morning sunlight. "They're performing the ceremony," Ayana whispered in amazement. "I've only heard stories, never seen it myself." "What ceremony?" "The acknowledgement. When the guardians of the land formally accept a new keeper of the sacred places." Her voice was filled with reverence. "Jacob, this hasn't happened in over 60 years." As they watched, the stallion began to move in a slow circle around the well, followed by the 3 other horses. Their movements were deliberate, almost dance-like, and each step seemed to pulse with meaning. The outer ring of horses remained perfectly still, creating a living mandala of protection around the sacred water. The ceremony continued for nearly an hour, the horses moving in patterns that seemed both ancient and eternal. When it finally concluded, the stallion approached the cabin and stood directly beneath the window where Jacob and Ayana watched. His dark eyes held intelligence and something deeper, a recognition that bridged the gap between species. "He's waiting for your acceptance," Ayana said softly. "You need to go to him." Jacob's heart pounded as he walked outside. The stallion remained motionless, allowing the old rancher to approach within arm's length. For a moment, that felt suspended. In time, man and horse regarded each other with mutual respect. Then Jacob did something he'd never done before with a wild animal. He extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace and partnership. The stallion lowered his magnificent head and gently touched his muzzle to Jacob's palm, sealing an agreement that transcended words. The moment the connection was made, every horse in the circle whinnied in unison, a sound so powerful and harmonious it seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then, as quickly as they'd come, they began to disperse, flowing back toward the hills like a tide returning to the sea. But the stallion remained. He walked to the well, drank deeply, then turned back to Jacob with what could only be described as a nod of farewell before galloping after his herd. "It's done," Ayana said from the porch. "You're officially the keeper now. The land will prosper under your protection, and the wild ones will always know this is a safe place." Jacob felt tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't say exactly why. "What does it mean? What am I supposed to do?" "Live as you've always lived, with kindness and respect for all creatures. Share your water with those who need it, offer shelter to the lost, and remember that you're part of something larger than yourself." She shouldered her small pack. "The land will guide you when guidance is needed." As Ayana prepared to leave, she paused at the edge of his property. "My aunt lives just 2 valleys over, and I have many cousins in the region. You won't be alone anymore, Jacob. The keeper of the sacred spring has family now, whether he realizes it or not." She walked away across the rolling hills, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared over the ridge. But Jacob didn't feel abandoned. Instead, he felt connected, part of an ancient network of people and places and creatures, all linked by invisible threads of respect and care. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Jacob noticed his cattle drinking from the well alongside a small group of deer. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry carrying no alarm, only acknowledgement. Even the wind seemed different, warmer and more welcoming than before. His solitary life hadn't ended. It had simply expanded to include responsibilities and relationships he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the hills, 53 wild horses grazed peacefully, guardians of an ancient promise that would continue long after he was gone. What an incredible journey of compassion, connection, and spiritual awakening. Jacob's simple act of kindness opened the door to a world of ancient wisdom and sacred responsibility that transformed not just his life, but his entire understanding of his place in the world. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this remind us that small acts of kindness can have profound consequences we never imagined. What do you think about the connection between Jacob's grandfather's promise and the horse's return? Do you believe in sacred places and ancient agreements? And have you ever experienced a moment when nature seemed to respond to human kindness? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to check out our other inspiring stories about the mysterious connections between humans and the natural world. Next week, we'll explore another incredible tale of unexpected bonds and ancient wisdom. Like this video if Jacob's transformation inspired you, and remember that every act of compassion creates ripples we may never see, but that change the world in ways both seen and unseen. See you in the next story, where the extraordinary hides within the ordinary.